The research vessel Wyville cut through a rogue swell, the bow dipping and briefly plunging into the cold, dark ocean on its way to its final destination. Brandon clutched the gunwale and gazed over the water at the other ships that accompanied his. By his count, no less than 24 vessels of various sizes and nationalities pushed through the waters to reach the designated coordinates of what would ultimately be the final resting place of world-renowned marine biologist Dr. Andres Montero. It made Brandon shiver with emotion to see so many people and nations join together to bid Dr. Montero farewell. He knew the doctor's reputation was widely respected and his impact far-reaching, but he had no idea so many individuals and organizations would show up to escort him and say their goodbyes. It warmed his heart, and, even if only temporarily, renewed his faith in humanity. As a trusted friend and one of Dr. Montero's closest colleagues, Brandon had fielded more than his fair share of questions from those in attendance regarding the doctor's unusual last request. It wasn't so much that Dr. Montero wanted his ashes scattered at sea. Brandon assumed most people would have been surprised if he didn't choose an ocean burial, but rather where he chose to have them scattered. Brandon had told the story more times than he could count. His recitation of the unbelievable tale was nearly word for word identical to Dr. Montero's own telling after hearing it multiple times over the years. And each time he told the tale, he was always left with the same lingering question. Did it actually happen? Dr. Montero swore on his life that the events of that day were true and accurate, even though he had no logical explanation for precisely how they could be true and accurate. Neither did Brandon, but he trusted his friend. Dr. Montero was a data-driven scientist and avowed atheist whose faith lay in the material world. He didn't believe in mysticism and held no special place for supernatural occurrences. For him, if it couldn't be proven or effectively researched, it fell into the realm of anecdotal hearsay. Needless to say, he butt heads with his more faith-based colleagues from time to time, though he never lost their respect, or they his. But he found himself in a quandary regarding his experience from 7 years ago, 120 feet below the ocean's surface, and it was so profound, it followed him to his deathbed and beyond. Dr. Montero was on his way from Palau to Micronesia's Chuck Lagoon as part of a research team to study the species-rich and ecologically relevant coral reef system there. On the trip, a pod of humpback whales was spotted, prompting Dr. Montero to request a temporary pause in their journey from the research vessel's captain so he could take advantage of the fortuitous encounter. The captain agreed, and several members of the research team geared up so they could dive and study the gentle giants. And that was where things got weird. Dr. Montero was one of 6 people to go into the water that day. By the end of the 30-minute dive, only 5 people came out. Dr. Montero wasn't one of them. A full search and rescue operation commenced, led by the U.S. Coast Guard Forces Micronesia Sector Guam. Sweeps were conducted in the area, and limited air support was provided, but Dr. Montero was nowhere to be found. The 5 other dive partners all admitted to losing sight of him at one point or another, but that was not uncommon. Everyone had been trained for the possibility of momentary separation, where a dive partner was briefly out of the line of sight, and with the unexpected gift of the humpback pod, it stood to reason that attention may have been more focused on the whales than on what any other diver was doing. The search continued for another 2 days until it was determined that even if the doctor had reached the surface, he likely had not remained there long. Each diver had been equipped with a diving strobe, so assuming Dr. Montero had activated it, the light would have stood out like a white dot on black paper on the nighttime ocean. But no one had seen any such light. And in a particularly distressing revelation, coordinates from his personal locator beacon could not be retrieved, suggesting it likely lay beneath the ocean's surface. To say the research team was devastated would be a gross understatement. No one could believe that Dr. Montero, a seasoned diver with decades of experience, had simply vanished. It didn't make sense. But when the search and rescue teams were unable to find him, that unbelievable scenario began to feel wholly real. Despondent, the research team decided to return to Palau to figure out what the next steps should be. But then, just as the research vessel started back, a miracle happened. Word came in over SATCOM that Dr. Montero had been found alive, just in the last place anyone would have thought to look. The news spread like a flashfire across the ship, each person's moment of elation at learning the doctor was still alive immediately tempered by the subsequent information of where he was found. No one could believe it. It seemed too impossible. But when the research vessel met up with the Coast Guard ship that had rescued him, any doubts were put to rest. Dr. Montero was alive. But the searing question of how he arrived at the place where he was rescued from remained, and was the first thing anyone who greeted him asked. How had he ended up on an uninhabited island nearly 140 miles away from where he had been diving? As intriguing as the question was, it was Dr. Montero's answer that left folks wide-eyed and slack-jawed. He had no idea. Picolot is a barren speck of an island in the state of Yap, which is part of the Federated States of Micronesia. At just over a quarter-mile long and less than a fifth of a mile wide, the tiny islet was ringed by a sandy beach and coral reefs with a tree-dense core. Dr. Montero wasn't the first person to become stranded on the island. Several accounts of sailors washing up on its shores, as rare as it was, have occurred over the island's history. but no one could recall anyone having arrived on the beach without having to escape a sinking vessel. Dr. Montero was more confused than anyone as to how he came to find himself on Picolat. He recalled diving with the 5 other members of the research crew and remembered the pod of humpbacks that had prompted him to get in the water in the first place. Initially, this was all he could recollect, but as he dug further into his memory, a trouble addendum to his story emerged. He had encountered trouble in the water. At some point, when he was more than 100 feet below the ocean's surface and away from his fellow divers, he realized that he was rapidly running out of oxygen. This made no sense as he calculated that he should have had at least 20 minutes remaining. After speaking with others post-rescue, it was determined that the doctor likely dove with a malfunctioning regulator, allowing his air to flow freely from the tank and deplete his oxygen at an increased rate. Dr. Montero confessed that he was so enraptured with the whale pod that he failed to accurately monitor his SPG. Had he done so regularly, he would have noticed the pressure in his oxygen tank decreasing abnormally. As a result, it was theorized that the doctor had lost consciousness when his air ran out. But this revelation was only half the puzzle. It still didn't explain how the doctor had arrived at Picolat and without any of his scuba gear intact. Theories ranged from floating unconscious on the water to amnesia from fighting to stay alive. But Dr. Montero had his own hypothesis, which he had shared only with his closest of friends. The ocean had saved him. He couldn't provide any rational explanation for why he believed that way, saying only that he felt it down to every atom of his soul. Somehow, some way, the ocean had rescued him from certain death. For Brandon, it was as good an explanation as any, maybe even a little more so. The flotilla reduced speed and eventually cut engine power. They had arrived. Funeral attendees transferred off the main ships to dinghies and rafts and motored to the coordinates dictated by Dr. Montero before his death. Those coordinates, Brandon would learn, marked the exact spot where he had dived with the pod of humpbacks all those years ago. Though Dr. Montero never directly admitted it, Brandon felt that his experience had forced him to reevaluate his atheistic beliefs. The location and the events that resulted from the dive had come to serve as a spiritual center in his life, whether he wanted to accept it or not. It didn't necessarily mean that he suddenly believed in a higher power, but Brandon felt he was less inclined to dismiss the notion so swiftly. A brief ceremony was held, and people were invited to speak via a bullhorn that was passed around before Dr. Montero's ashes were finally poured onto the ocean's surface. A moment of silence followed, then everyone motored back to their respective vessels. Brandon bid his friend and Thierry goodbye, and climbed back aboard the research vessel Wyville. The ride back to Palau would be long, but he knew the air would be filled with stories and memories of Dr. Montero's distinguished career, the bulk of which had been devoted to the preservation and protection of marine life and ecosystems. As the sun set, Brandon followed other attendees inside to the mess deck to raise a glass to Dr. Montero. He assumed the crews of the other ships were doing the same thing, which provided him with some level of comfort. Though happy to be among friends and colleagues, a part of him wanted to go back topside and watch the sun close out the day over the waters of the Pacific and Dr. Montero's final resting place. Perhaps if he had, he might have witnessed his own miracle when he discovered hundreds of sea creatures placidly swimming in a colossal circle, the center point of which marked the exact location where Dr. Montero's ashes had been sprinkled into the sea.